The year 1945 marked a turning point in human history. As the ashes of World War II settled, the United Nations emerged, a beacon of hope against global conflict. The UN's founders envisioned a world governed by cooperation, not conquest. This vision, however, was built upon a world order still reeling from colonialism. The victors of the war, particularly the Allied powers, wielded significant influence in shaping the organization's structure. This power dynamic cast a long shadow, reflecting the global power imbalances of the time. The old empires may have crumbled, but their legacy lingered in the newly established international order. This legacy is evident in the structure of the UN Security Council, with its 5 permanent members holding veto power. The Security Council, often described as the UN's most powerful body, bears the mark of the colonial era. Its 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, were the victors of World War II. This structure grants disproportionate power to a select few, echoing colonial rule dynamics. The veto power allows these nations to block actions they deem unfavorable, even if supported by a majority of UN members. This imbalance of power has long been a source of contention, particularly for nations in the global South. Many of these countries, once subjects of colonial empires, argue that the current structure fails to reflect their aspirations and voices. The calls for reform are about addressing a historical wrong and dismantling the remnants of a colonial system. The demand for UN reform is not new. Since its inception, the organization has faced criticism for its structure and power dynamics. However, recent years have witnessed a surge in calls for change, particularly from countries in the global South. These nations, representing the majority of the world's population, are increasingly vocal in their demands for a more equitable and representative UN. Leaders from Africa, Latin America, and Asia have repeatedly called for reforms, particularly of the Security Council. They argue that the current structure undermines their sovereignty and limits their ability to influence decisions that impact them. The call for reform is no longer a whisper from the margins. It is a resounding chorus echoing across continents. The rise of emerging economies has emboldened nations to challenge the status quo. The question is no longer whether the UN should be reformed, but how. Section 4. Remodeling Global Power Visions for a New UN. The calls for UN reform have translated into various concrete proposals aimed at addressing the organization's shortcomings. One of the most common demands is the expansion of the Security Council. Proponents argue that adding more permanent and non-permanent members would enhance the Council's legitimacy and representation. They propose including countries like India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, reflecting their economic and political clout. Other proposals focus on reforming the veto power. Some suggest abolishing it altogether, while others propose limiting its use to Chapter 7 matters, dealing with threats to peace and acts of aggression. Beyond the Security Council, there are proposals to strengthen the UN General Assembly, making it a more effective deliberative body. These proposals share a common goal: to create a more democratic, representative, and effective UN. Section 5. Roadblocks to reform, resistance, and inertia. Despite the growing consensus on the need for UN reform, the path to achieving it remains fraught with obstacles. The very nature of the UN, a consensus-based organization, makes it difficult to implement significant changes. The most significant hurdle comes from the permanent members of the Security Council themselves. Any reform that alters the Council's composition or diminishes the veto power would require the consent of all 5 permanent members. Furthermore, there is no consensus among UN members on the specifics of reform, making it difficult to build the necessary coalitions. The current global order, characterized by shifting power dynamics, makes it difficult to foster the cooperation needed for significant UN reform. Section 6. A Transformed World. The Promise and Peril of Change. The potential impacts of successful UN reform are far-reaching, with the power to reshape global governance. A reformed UN, more representative and effective, could usher in a new era of multilateralism. A more inclusive Security Council could lead to more balanced decision-making on issues of peace and security. It could also enhance the legitimacy of UN interventions, reducing accusations of double standards. A strengthened General Assembly could provide a more democratic platform for global dialogue. However, reform also carries potential risks. A hastily implemented or poorly designed reform could exacerbate existing tensions. The pursuit of UN reform requires careful consideration, strategic thinking, and a willingness to compromise.